Hello and welcome to the review of the day, which, as you will have noticed from the thumbnail, is Anne McCaffrey's Restoree. Let me see if I can get that without reflection. It's amazing how much reflection there is, considering that we haven't barely seen the sun for weeks. There we go. Restoree. Okay, so this book is one that I read a long time ago. I am 99% certain. Unlike most books that I read a long time ago in my classic sci-fi era, I don't remember it very well at all. In fact, there were times when I wasn't at all certain that I had read it. So this copy is one I picked up recently. It's not the original edition. This one is a Corgi reprinting from 1990. I actually really like this cover. I think this cover's nicer than some of the original covers for this book, to be honest, and it's in pretty good condition, so I'm going to hang on to it. Restoree is a really good old school classic sci-fi type story, and of course it's from Anne McCaffrey. She's a leading name in the field. She was one of the early science fiction writers, one of the early women science fiction writers who did really well in the genre. She's probably best remembered for her Pern series because, dragons, telepathic dragons that bond with their riders. That's a theme that I don't think anyone had done it before her, and it never got old. But this book is actually her first book, and it was published in 1967. That's it. So it's a late 60s book. So the gist of the story is our protagonist is a modern day, so late 60s American woman. She's captured while going for a walk in Central Park and goes by aliens and goes through a fractured, poorly remembered series of horror scenes which are vividly described on the back. There was a sudden stench of dead sea creature. Poor sea creature. Not really. There was the horror of a large, huge black shape closing over her. There was nothing. Then there were pieces of memory. Isolated fragments that were so horrible her mind refused to accept them. Intense heat and shivering cold, excruciating pain, dismembered pieces of the human body, sawn bones and searing screams. And that makes it sound like a horror. And it isn't. And it makes it sound like a very happening, eventful book, and it isn't really all that fast-paced. But it does start off with that sets our character. So after this poorly remembered, fractured horror scene scenario type thing, she starts coming out of a fugue. Her brain's fogged. She doesn't really know where or how things are. She has the sense of people yelling at her repeatedly to do things which she doesn't always understand. There's words, there's language that she doesn't understand, but she's too vague to realize to be able to differentiate between a different language and whether she just can't understand. So she comes and goes and her thoughts are fuzzy, doesn't know where she is or anything like that. Now, I really enjoyed this slow waking up part, and through fragments, she realizes that she's in a sanatorium kind of environment, a whole heap of tiny white cottages in this pastoral green garden type environment that's populated entirely by couples. Young, pretty women leading around men who are shambling hulks, basically semi-catatonic. And she is one of those young women who's tending to a man who is not there. Basically, his body's there, but he seems to have no personality. He doesn't really seem to be a real person. She leads him around with a harness. She feeds him when speakers yell at her to feed him with whatever they tell her to do. She sits doing nothing for the rest of the time. So this slow awakening into a feeling of threat, being treated like an automaton, I thought that was really, really well done. I love this first section of the book better than any. It's not a particularly long one, but because of the way it's written, it feels imminent and you feel your awareness rising with protagonists. she realizes a few things early on. She is not really the same physically as she was. And we kind of get the image through her own mind that she wasn't considered pretty in her era. She has to keep stopping herself from feeling her nose because she didn't like her nose, but her parents wouldn't let her get a nose job. Ugh. I hope YouTube didn't notice it. Nose job. Because apparently in the 60s, only Jews got nose jobs, and they're not even calling it a nose job here, they're calling it a nose bob. Does anyone remember the 60s that they used to call that a bob? Or was it a typo? I'm not sure. There's a few typos in this book. The most common one being this last sentence on a page being repeated on the next page. But no biggie. So we hear a bit about Sarah's background and who she is. We find that the keepers of this sanatorium are treating her as if she's intellectually disabled and being used as a carer. And she eventually realized that the man that she's caring for is not himself disabled or ill, he's being drugged. Because she's being treated as virtually nothing more than a moron level intellectual understanding, people talk around her as if she isn't there. And she finds that there's some sort of conspiracy of people who are drugging him into submission. One member of the conspiracy is frightened that the levels aren't high enough and he's going to come out. The other one reassures him. So this phase ends when she gets sick of this scenario and of the drugging, and she realizes that the drug is being topped up by his food. Every day that they get a meal, 2 colors are delivered, red and blue. One is for the patient, one is for her. She stops giving the patient that food, she starts giving him part of hers, and slowly he comes out. And when he comes out of that and she starts explaining to him what's happening and they escape the sanatorium, it's quite an exciting way in which they do that. But at that point, that whole early phase starts, and the next phase of the book feels quite different. So we have this learning about the world phase as she finds out about it from her patient, Harlan. It's got a fairly different social dynamic to Earth, which was interesting. This planet or society already has interstellar travel, but they didn't develop it, they captured it. So there's strange unevennesses between the level of technology in the world versus Earth. We find out that the man, Harlan, was the regent of the world. He was the ruler, the hereditary ruler of the earth, the warlord, was not of age when his father died. So Harlan, being his uncle, became regent when the young man inherited. And he was being drugged. Now that he's been drugged into submission, the person who's currently acting regent is the same person, surprise, surprise, who got him out of the way. Now, not at this point, but later on, we learn that the people who can be regents are limited to warlords, because the world of Lothar is experiencing a long-term interstellar war with the species they know as the Mill. And that's who they've captured, what ships they do have from. So the Mill considers all other intelligent species basically as meat. And they go to other worlds, they raid them, they capture their population, they do horrible things, as per back of the book, to them, and they take them off to their planet. And we don't need to go into that. So the planet of Lothar has got a couple of other interstellar allies, and they've got small starships, not as capable of those of the Mel, but they've been resisting, and they've been creating barriers to them. One slowly gets the impression that the only way Sarah can be on this planet is if the Mill have now added Earth to their meat run, and she was picked up by them. Now from this point, Sarah and Harlan are escaping from the sanatorium. They're trying to find his friends and political allies and make sure they're not recaptured. and get to the person he was regent for, and basically evade, captive by the bad guy who's called Gorlot, and his political machinations. And this is actually quite an interesting bit. There's sailing, there's escaping, there's running, there's, well, learning about the world in quite an interesting way. So once that part is complete, you move into a next stage, and the novel does feel a bit as if it's stages by stages. And Anne McCaffrey by 1967 had been a full-time publishing author for I think 2 years, but this was her first actual novel. So I think that feeling of writing an individual story still persists in it a little bit. It's a lot smoother than many other books which are an amalgam of stories, but there's still this stage by stage feeling. And then we enter the majority of the novel, and this stage is basically about political struggles, the council efforts to defeating the bad guy, Gorlot, and his political system, which has completely overtaken the military, and there's a strange war happening in space with a planet that has incredibly non-combative population, so they don't understand what's happening there, but they realize it's some kind of plot on Gorlot's behalf. And there's still the fact that Harlan was being drugged by medical doctors, one or two of which are very trusted. Sarah doesn't trust the main one. The main one is one she remains terrified of throughout, because he seems to be the one that experimenting on her to the point where she became what she was in the sanatorium. And we don't know exactly what he did. We never really find out exactly what he did or didn't do and exactly how bad it is. He's called Physician Monsolit, and his defense by people like Harlan is as incomprehensible as the things that he must have done, which have been totally antithetical to his society, namely restorees. Restorees are loathed and feared throughout the society, and when Harlan discovers that Sarah is one, he makes sure that she won't disclose this fact to anyone, and won't disclose the fact that she's from another planet. So this, the majority of the novel, is these political machinations, and that's why it ends up being quite a slow novel. In terms of science fiction, it's a good novel because it's got certainly enough science to qualify as soft science fiction even today. Anne McCaffrey herself never thought of herself as a fantasy writer because there was always a science element to her plots and her books, and there is here. It's certainly not what people today would call hard science. No one goes down into the depth of the Mal ship and explains how the drive works or anything like that. But yeah, I'd say definitely science fiction side of the fence over fantasy. Right, so this pressure that Sarah's under from Harlan to conceal that she's not from Lothar is an ongoing theme, and there's no info dumping here. We slowly and organically learn that restorees are hated and feared, and we get the eventual picture that the restoree comes from early experiments to bring someone maybe back to life. So basically they look upon restorees as animated corpses, and they expect not much more than that from them. And one of the first things that the Mel do with captives on board their ship is skin them alive. So there's a lot of mental issues that are going to arise from a human being that's skinned alive. And the Lotharians are so terrified of the Mel that there's also a medical expectation that they will go insane and as soon as they're captured and taken on board the ship. Okay, so the writing in this book is very good indeed, I'm going to say. It's the better side of 60s sci-fi. Well, the plot seems a bit pulpy to us today. At the time it was written, it was still interesting, intriguing, and new, and there is nothing pulpy about the way it's written, and nothing pulpy about the characters. They are fleshed out, they are full-bodied. This isn't a huge book by my standards, but it took me a couple of days to read because it's a slow read. There's a lot in it. There's a lot to absorb. It's not that fast fix that you get from naming no names, pointing no fingers, a lot of pulp sci-fi of its era. And I love pulp sci-fi. There's plenty up there that I adore and reread, and I've got a sort of humour. You need humour for true pulp sci-fi, and a childish enjoyment of them. But this doesn't have that. This has real writing skills and a real beauty to the writing. A well fleshed out, full-bodied book, if you will. The first bit was definitely my favourite, but after a certain about a third way through, I felt that the writing and the plot just kept getting stronger and stronger and better as you went through. The ending is quite satisfying overall. Now, has it dated? Yes, it really has, in several but often unexpected sort of ways. The writing hasn't, the story structure hasn't. It isn't one of those where you have to, like some Heinlein work, for example, has dated so badly you have to struggle to keep yourself involved. No, I didn't have to struggle with this at all. It was no struggle. But, so what Anne McCaffrey was trying for here was well documented. Her son, Todd, is it? Quoted this often, and many other sources have as well. I'll quote from Wikipedia here. McCaffrey's first novel was Restoree, published by Ballantine Books in 1967. Unlike most science fiction books of the era, Restoree's heroine is a strong-willed, intelligent woman who is willing and able to think for herself and act on her own initiative. McCaffrey was widely quoted as saying that Restoree was indeed a jab at how women were usually portrayed in science fiction. And yes, science fiction was, at the point when McCaffrey started writing, largely male authors and largely male readership. So this attempt to have a jab at them is very valid. And while I love reading this era, there is a strong element of female characters spending most of their time either squealing or cuddling up to strong male protective chests. No problem with squealing. Squealing works in some scenarios. Nothing will do but a squeal, right? And even here, we've got a certain amount of cuddling up to strong male chests because there is a romance subplot between Harlan and Sarah. But well-rounded female protagonists, they were quite rare. And while Sarah works for her time extremely well, very impressively written, to a modern reader she will probably seem behind the times, and I guess really she should, because this Sarah was picked up from a contemporary to this book, New York. So she would have been born in the 50s, and she's depicted as coming from a small Midwest family. I think McCaffrey specifies where, and by the sound of it, she was in a family where women cooked and cleaned, and her father grumbled about her getting an education, and she pretty much had to pack her suitcase and run away to New York to get a job as a librarian with an advertising company. So Sarah was progressive for her era, as well as for the novel's era of publication. But like many strong female protagonists in mainstream fiction of the era, she and her actions come across as maybe a bit dated to us today. In other ways it's dated. Lothar's society is lightly described, and it's obviously divergent from Earth's society, and those differences are very interesting, but it is still essentially a patriarchal society. In the 60s, men being protective of their women would have been considered a lot more cute than it is today, and this is written as being quite protective, and it has dated in that sense. Not terribly, but I do feel another author, female author writing around about the same time, I believe, Marion Zimmer Bradley, when she was writing Darkover, she was trying to explore how the male-female dynamics might go in a different world or a different scenario. So it was speculative fiction, and I think to that extent this is speculative fiction, but it's speculating from the 60s, it's not speculating from the 2020s, so the core assumptions date the conclusions, if that makes sense. Some books managed to write ahead of their time and their conclusions aren't dated. Here it is a little bit, but not terribly so. I don't think it would be offensive to any except some really dramatic equalists out there. And I didn't find it annoying, just maybe a tiny bit dated. Now, as to the love story between Sarah and Harlan, I liked it. Not everyone, I suspect, will, but I personally enjoyed it. The romance isn't a big part of the story. It's just part of the normal narrative of Sarah maturing as a human being. Some things that McCaffrey did are things you're unlikely to see in a modern book. For example, Sarah, before she even really describes herself as Sarah, while she's still barely functioning in the sanatorium, she describes her charge as the ugly man. Of course, she has no name for him, and he is basically an empty hulk. She describes him that way until he reanimates, whereupon she finds his character inhabits his features and his body, so instead of just being an ugly hulk, he becomes a very charismatic, very interesting man, and she becomes interested in him as a man. So what you've got here is not something I can think of a lot of books that do, but it's definitely not insta-love. You've got someone, she didn't fall in love with his chiseled cheekbones, there's none of that, oh, he's so gorgeous. She's described him as not gorgeous, quite the opposite. He's ugly, but his character and his charisma and his personality, once inhabited the body, make him very attractive to her. So that was interesting, and I don't think you could get away with it that easily in writing today, but I really liked what McCaffrey did with that. It's not something that got done a lot in the writing of the era. Okay, so stereotype of the experienced man and the inexperienced female worked for Mills and Boone for centuries. You get that here. It's bearable. It's a real stereotype. It's real here. Okay. Now, in the Lothar Society, women are much more protected than on Earth, except when they're not. And they've got a lot more autonomy, except when they don't. And I can't quite wrap my head around what McCaffrey was doing there. But there's things and stuffs. Women are considered very prized possessions, mainly because they're potential mothers. And yes, that phrase was used. And 1960s, what can I say? What a male does when he wants someone is he claims the woman, and she either acknowledges and accepts that claim or she doesn't. There doesn't seem to be any religion, and there doesn't seem to be any true marriage rights. It's a private agreement between two people, though obviously family and friends can have their input. And for a while, Sarah pretends to be the love interest of the new heir when the Gorland and his bad guys are trying to discredit him for being impotent. She manages to convince them all that they're lovers when really they aren't. And yes, our Sarah in here does have a lot of strong will, moderate strong will, no girl boss, thank goodness, but strong will, able to think on her feet. She's intelligent and willing to make her own decisions. But Sarah's competency is realistically capable. She's no superhero, and she's no ultimate warrior. She's strong enough to do things that need doing, and she's interesting enough to think things through so things work. Come on, Ben. Stop screaming. Come on. No? Okay. But between the pros and the cons, you have a realistic and believable character that makes her interesting, flawed, and very relatable, which is a nice change to a lot of the sci-fi women of its era. And not only was it fairly unusual for its era, that kind of relatable, everyday woman character is still a little bit unusual in a lot of modern science fiction. To my way of thinking, it's more common than it was, but it's still, you still end up with a lot of girl boss Wonder Women. Anyway, enough of that. About Sarah, she does have this weird kind of little odd dissociation. From the point where she wakes up and she finds she's in a different skin, and she's much more pretty than she used to be, she kind of seems to shuck off Earth and her history completely. She doesn't appear to have any ties to Earth. She doesn't seem to think about it or have any interest in potentially returning to it, which Helen at one stage suggests might be possible. She didn't have a lot of strong attachment to Earth, but and they are under fire and running a lot of the time, and lots of stuff is happening. So I guess in context it's fine, but I do think this dissociation from her previous life on Earth is very different to how I expect a modern author would have written it. And I guess that's kind of one of the things which a cynical reader could see as a flaw about this book, and there's other things that are certainly you can see as flaws. I wasn't inclined to be overly critical because overall I really enjoyed this book and I didn't have a lot of problems with it. The slowness of plot is what I think is the reason why I don't actually remember reading it previously. I think I first read it, I was expecting a fast-paced plot, something maybe more like the Pern books, or I was expecting something more horror-based from the description, but the very slow political build-up, interesting machinations that I'm enjoying as an adult, I probably would have found a bit tedious when I was 16 or 17, and that might be why I really remember almost none of this book. There's a couple of snippets here and there that I do, but overall, I won't. Now, well, as you can tell, I really enjoyed this book overall. There's one thing that I really am dubious about. At the end, there was a conclusion drawn to round out the story that I don't think holds true. It's about the surgeon, scientist, medical guy he's definitely a bad guy, but he's a nuanced character. He isn't represented as stereotypically bad or good. He definitely does some pretty bad things. No doubt about that. But he also is depicted as a morally ambiguous character, which is another thing you don't see in pulp science fiction. He is very true to his own notions, but from Sarah's point of view, very much a bad guy for his actions. Even Harlan will forgive himself being drugged and knocked out and rendered incompetent and accused of having had mental breakdowns and everything, which are every bit as bad in this society as they were considered in the 60s America. He forgives that. Sarah's terrified of him. And in the end, she stops being terrified of him due to a conclusion that I don't think is justified. But I'm not going to add that into this because it is a total spoiler. And if you've borne with me this far, you're probably going to listen to the spoiler. I don't think this book deserves it. I think this book deserves to be read cold without knowing the end of it or any spoilers. And if you like classic sci-fi and anything I've said about this book sounds intriguing, I urge you to read it and then come back and comment. I'd be interested to see if anyone else sees this small quirk in the ending that I don't think is logically justified. Wow, I've talked about this book a lot. There's a lot to talk though. I could keep talking about this book. One thing that did make me wonder, in this day and age, people who write literature and PhDs and stuff about treatment of women characters and feminism in various types of literature is pervasive. There's heaps of them out there. I'm not terribly interested in that genre, though I've read a few books. I would, however, be really interested in reading a book in which someone compared feminism and female characters in classic sci-fi, and I'd love to hear what they say about Restoree versus maybe some of the Marion Zimmer Bradley books. If you are watching this and you have ever read any such book or article, Do please recommend it, because I think that there's a lot to unpack here, as the kids on YouTube like to say, about the character of this woman, how she relates to women from her era, how she relates to the writing from her era, and what we in the 2020s can actually take away from that character into projected sci-fi books in the future that will be written and which I anticipate reading. Anyhow, a very long review. Thank you to anyone who's made it through 30 minutes of me raving about this really excellent, very classic sci-fi first novel by Anne McCaffrey, which I do thoroughly recommend to people who like reading in the genre. So, yep, thanks for watching. Comment if you want to, and always read good books.